The director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation signed his name to a memo authorizing the deliberate fabrication of a story designed to make a young actress lose her child, her mind, and her life, and it worked on all 3 counts. This is not a rumor, not a conspiracy theory, and not a story Hollywood once told. It is a government document, readable by any citizen who requests it, and it is one of 16. The marriage MGM built for 3, Van Johnson. Before we go any further, you need to know who Van Johnson actually was, because the suppression only works if you understand what was being protected and what was being lost. In the 1940s, Van Johnson was exactly what America needed. Freckled, cheerful, boyishly handsome. He was MGM's answer to every mother's dream of the perfect son-in-law and every young woman's vision of the ideal sweetheart. His appeal was built on a quality that studios spent millions manufacturing in other stars, but found genuinely and naturally in him. He seemed uncomplicated, safe, transparently, reassuringly American. Audiences did not merely admire Van Johnson, they trusted him, and that trust was the most valuable thing Louis B. Mayer owned. What those audiences never suspected was that the uncomplicated all-American face on the screen was the surface of an architectural fiction so elaborate it required 4 people's daily participation to maintain, and that the man who built that fiction was not Van Johnson at all. Johnson was a gay man in an era when that reality was not merely career-ending, but legally prosecutable as a criminal offense. His close relationship with designer Keenan Wynn had remained known only within a very small circle of trusted individuals until the day Mayer discovered it. What followed was not a conversation about discretion or a quiet warning. What followed was an act of institutional engineering so audacious it is almost difficult to believe, and so thoroughly documented in subsequent testimony that it cannot be dismissed. Mayer summoned Keenan Wynn and presented him with a choice framed as a requirement. Wynn would dissolve his marriage to his wife, Evie. Evie would then marry Van Johnson. The arrangement would be presented to the public as a conventional Hollywood romance. Johnson and Wynn's friendship would continue, yet everyone involved would maintain the fiction indefinitely. A single studio contract asset would be protected. The human cost would be distributed across 4 people who had not asked to pay it. Evie Wynn entered this arrangement with full knowledge of its nature. In later years, she spoke about those decades with a dignity and clarity that made her account impossible to dismiss. She described a life lived inside a structure built entirely by someone else's hand, for someone else's purposes, with her own needs and desires treated as negligible considerations. Keenan Wynn, the man she had actually married for love, became her former husband and her new husband's closest companion, all within a framework designed in a single meeting in a studio executive's office. And I watched Van Johnson's films from those years, knowing what his life actually contained. The camera captured something without understanding what it was recording, a particular quality of wistfulness, a smile that arrives on time and lands correctly, and somehow does not quite reach the eyes. The sadness of a man performing contentment he was never permitted to actually feel, preserved forever in celluloid, visible to anyone who knows what they are looking at. The suppression of Van Johnson's true life required no dramatic acts of cover-up. It required only that 4 people wake up every morning and perform the roles assigned to them by one powerful man who had decided that his investment was worth more than their freedom. They did it for decades, and Hollywood called it a love story. The genius they called a pretty face, Hedy Lamarr. There is a patent filed with the United States government on August 11, 1942, patent number 2,292,387. It describes a frequency-hopping communication system designed to prevent the jamming of torpedo guidance signals during wartime. The name on that patent is Hedy Lamarr. On the same day that patent was sitting in a government filing office, MGM's publicity department was distributing press materials describing Hedy Lamarr as, in their precise chosen words, the most beautiful woman in the world. Both of those things are true. Together, they constitute one of the most complete and consequential suppressions in the history of American culture. And it required no conspiracy, no villain giving orders, and no files deliberately destroyed. It required only the unthinking application of an assumption so total it functioned like gravity, that a woman who looked the way Hedy Lamarr looked could not possibly also think the way Hedy Lamarr thought. She was born Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler in Vienna in 1914. By the time she reached Hollywood, she had already lived a life that would have made a remarkable film entirely without the acting career that followed. She had escaped her first marriage to Friedrich Mandl, an arms manufacturer with documented connections to the Nazi regime, by disguising herself as a household servant and fleeing to Paris. Mandl's dinner parties had been attended by weapons developers, military officials, and figures whose conversations covered military communication technology in considerable technical detail. And Lamarr had listened, remembered, and understood. Working with composer George Antheil, she developed the frequency hopping system that the patent describes. The United States Navy received the patent, acknowledged its receipt, reviewed it, and filed it away without serious consideration. No documented technical objection, no explanation of why the technology was unworkable. It was set aside by an institution that had no framework for taking seriously an invention submitted by an actress. Think about that for a moment. Think about the last time you used your telephone to connect to a wireless network. Think about the navigation system that guided you home. Think about the wireless technology connecting virtually every device in your house. The foundation of all of it was laid by a woman sitting in a Hollywood apartment in the evenings, working alone, because the studio that owned her days had absolutely no idea what she was doing with her nights. The patent expired in 1959. Its core principles were independently rediscovered by military engineers in the 1960s and began their journey toward technologies worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Lamarr received nothing. No compensation, no royalty, no formal acknowledgement from the industries her work had made possible, until she was in her 80s, frail and largely a recluse, the recognition arriving decades too late to restore what the dismissal had taken from her. She passed away in the year 2000. The Navy file and the MGM publicity file still exist. They can be read side by side. Patent number 2,292,387. It is still there. You can look it up. Her name is on it. The dancer they dressed to hide, Vera Ellen. The next time you watch White Christmas, do something most people have never thought to do. Watch Vera Ellen, really watch her with your full attention, and then look at what the costume department is doing around her neck. Her dancing needs no instruction to appreciate. The extraordinary precision of her movement, the quality of controlled grace that made Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire both perform at their absolute peak, simply because she required them to. There is a joy in those sequences that is entirely genuine and entirely earned. The joy of a body doing exactly what it was built to do at the exact moment of its greatest capability. Now look at the costumes. In her earliest films, Vera Ellen's clothing is what the roles require. Varied, period-appropriate, designed around the characters she is playing. By the early 1950s, something had changed. The neck pieces become consistent in a way that exceeds any character requirement. High collars, elaborate scarves, draped fabric arranged with a specificity that has nothing to do with the scene and everything to do with the frame. Customers and colleagues who worked with her during those years described, in later interviews, a physical deterioration that the camera was being carefully arranged to avoid. The evidence that Vera Ellen suffered from severe anorexia throughout the latter portion of her Hollywood career is circumstantial. She never spoke publicly about her health, no medical records have been released, and no studio document has surfaced explicitly ordering her concealment. What exists is a visual record in the films themselves, costume choices documented in production records, and accounts from those who worked beside her describing a woman whose physical condition was the subject of private concern and public silence simultaneously. What is not circumstantial is what happened when the concealment became insufficient. There was no farewell film, no tribute screening, no honorary acknowledgement of what she had contributed to some of the most beloved musical sequences in Hollywood history. The studio that had spent years arranging its camera angles around her condition spent no equivalent energy on her welfare when the condition made filming impractical. Her contract was simply not renewed. She was let go with the efficiency of a broken prop. She spent her final years in near total isolation, severe arthritis having taken away the physical capability that had been her entire identity and her entire value to the industry that had employed her. She passed away in 1981. The high collars are still in the films. They are there in every frame, in every screening, visible to anyone who has been told what to look for. And the dancing, the extraordinary, specific, irreplaceable dancing that made her one of the most luminous performers of her era, stopped long before it should have. Nobody in the building where those costume decisions were made ever wrote that down as a loss, but it was. The man who had to be a hero, Audie Murphy. The statistics attached to Audie Murphy's military service during the Second World War read like something a novelist would reject for being implausible. 240 confirmed battlefield engagements. Every major combat decoration the United States Army could award. The Medal of Honor, earned at the age of 19 when he stood on a burning tank destroyer and held off an entire company of German soldiers alone. He was, by any measurable standard, the most decorated American combat soldier of the entire war. He was also, by the time he returned home, a young man who slept with a loaded firearm beneath his pillow and could not tolerate a closed door in a room he occupied. Universal Pictures signed Murphy almost immediately upon his return, and when the logic was entirely sound from a commercial perspective. Here was the genuine article, the real American hero, not an actor playing one. The studio did not need to manufacture his story. They needed only to present it, protect it, and ensure that the man delivering it on screen continued to look the part. What the studio needed to suppress, and what documentation from the period indicates they actively discouraged, was Murphy's own impulse to tell the truth about what combat had done to him. He wrote and spoke about his psychological suffering with a directness unprecedented for a public figure of his standing. He described the night terrors, the inability to be in enclosed spaces, the hair-trigger alertness that never fully stood down, even years after the fighting ended. He understood, with a clarity that contemporary medicine would recognize as accurate, that he had brought the war home inside him, and that no amount of medals or applause was going to extract it. The message from his handlers was consistent, and it was practical. The medals were the story. The suffering was a complication. The American hero did not discuss what the heroism had cost him, not because it was untrue, but because the audience had not paid to hear that particular truth. Studio correspondence from the period documents the concern with which those handlers received his honesty. The worry was not for Murphy's welfare. The worry was for his viability. Murphy passed away in a plane accident in 1971, largely financially ruined, and never having received the sustained public acknowledgement his honesty had been reaching toward for 2 decades. But think about what that suppression cost beyond Murphy himself. Think about every man who came home from combat in those years and looked to the greatest hero they knew for permission to speak about what they had carried home. What they received from the institutions that managed his image was a continued performance of invulnerability. The men who needed to hear Audie Murphy say that heroes sometimes cannot sleep, that the war follows you home and the medals do not help, never heard it. The suppression did not only damage one man, it told an entire generation of veterans that their suffering was something to be managed rather than acknowledged. And that may have been the most costly suppression in this entire collection. The leading man they would not let be human, Montgomery Clift. Ask anyone who studied film seriously in the 1950s what they thought they were watching when they watched Montgomery Clift. And the answer, from directors, from co-stars, from the critics who reviewed him, was almost invariably some version of the same observation, that here was something the camera had not encountered before, a quality of interior life so genuine and so undefended that the screen seemed to thin when he appeared on it. Elizabeth Taylor, who acted beside him and loved him with a ferocity and loyalty that lasted until his passing, called him the most beautiful man she had ever seen, and she was not speaking only of his face. And what the studio system required Montgomery Clift to suppress was his fundamental identity. He was a gay man in an era when that reality carried not merely professional consequences, but criminal ones. The laws under which he lived made his authentic life a prosecutable offense. The industry that celebrated his talent on screen required his silence about who he was off-screen as the price of continued employment. His publicists managed his image. The press, which understood the situation and had its own reasons to cooperate, asked the questions they were permitted to ask and did not pursue the ones they were not. The self-destruction that followed, the alcohol, the prescription substances taken in combinations that alarmed everyone close to him, the physical deterioration that aged him decades in the space of a few years, was narrated publicly as weakness, as for lack of discipline, as the tragic unraveling of a man who could not handle success. This was the story the industry offered, and because the industry controlled the narrative machinery, it was the story that was accepted and repeated. What was never publicly named was the causal chain, the documented connection between what Clift was required to be, publicly, daily, contractually, and what that requirement was doing to a man of his particular sensitivity and intelligence. Patricia Bosworth's biography of Clift, one of the most carefully researched accounts of any Hollywood figure's interior life, makes this connection with precision. The suffering was not incidental to the suppression. The suppression produced the suffering, and the industry that produced the suppression watched the suffering and called it a character flaw. Clift passed away in 1966. He was 45 years old. The films he left behind, A Place in the Sun, From Here to Eternity, Judgment at Nuremberg, contain performances of such concentrated humanity that they continue to stop viewers completely, decades after his passing. And here is the terrible irony that the industry never acknowledged. The required silence gave him a grief so private and so total that it had nowhere to go except the screen. The suppression that destroyed the man may have been precisely what made the artist irreplaceable, for the industry that required his silence made those performances possible in the most devastating way imaginable, and never once admitted what it had done to produce them. The actress the government targeted, Jean Seberg. In 1970, J. Edgar Hoover signed his name to a memorandum authorizing a specific operation against a specific individual. The individual was not a foreign agent, not a criminal under investigation, not a figure connected to organized crime or national security in any operational sense. The individual was Jean Seberg, an actress from Marshalltown, Iowa, who had appeared in a French film called Breathless and had subsequently used her fame and her resources to donate money to civil rights organizations. The operation was part of the FBI's COINTELPRO program, a documented, subsequently investigated, congressionally examined initiative designed to neutralize individuals the Bureau considered politically inconvenient through the deliberate fabrication and distribution of damaging false information. The COINTELPRO files are not allegations. They are government records, released under the Freedom of Information Act, readable by any citizen who requests them. The specific operation against Seberg involved the planting of a fabricated story with Los Angeles Times columnist Joyce Haber and subsequently with Newsweek magazine. The story claimed that Seberg's unborn child had been fathered by a member of the Black Panther Party. The story was entirely false. It was fabricated by federal employees operating under written authorization from the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was then distributed to journalists who published it. Jean Seberg was expecting a child. She read what had been written about her baby. She went into premature labor. Her daughter was brought into the world too early and survived only 2 days. Seberg held an open casket viewing of her infant daughter, specifically to demonstrate to anyone willing to look that the child's parentage was exactly what she had always said it was. The FBI's story had been false in every particular. The Bureau knew this. They had created the falsehood themselves. Seberg experienced a breakdown every year on the anniversary of her daughter's passing for the remaining 9 years of her life. She was found gone in Paris in 1979. The authorization memo bearing Hoover's signature exists. It has been examined by journalists, historians, and a United States court. The press that received the fabricated story and published it was aware of the documents confirming the FBI's role for years before Seberg's passing, and the story of the Bureau's culpability went almost entirely unreported until long after she was gone. This channel exists because people who cared about the truth refused to let stories like Jean Seberg's stay buried. If that matters to you, subscribe now, because there are 10 more stories in this video, and we are not finished yet. What is coming does not become less extraordinary. The set where everyone looked away, Lana Turner. Everything we have discussed so far involves powerful institutions suppressing individual truths. A studio head's decision, a cultural assumption so complete it needed no enforcement. A government bureau with a signed memorandum. What comes next involves something different. A suppression so total that it operated inside the most glamorous machinery Hollywood ever built, in full view of an entire industry. For decades, nobody had to classify it. Nobody had to destroy the evidence. The evidence was in every contract renewal, every studio photograph, every carefully worded press release, and almost no one, for most of that time, thought to question any of it. There is a version of Lana Turner's story that Hollywood told with great efficiency and considerable enthusiasm. The drugstore discovery, the platinum hair, the sweater girl, the succession of marriages, 8 in total, to 7 different men. Narrated by the press with a knowing amusement that treated her personal life as a form of entertainment provided for public consumption. And that version existed to serve the studio. It was designed, maintained, and distributed by professionals whose sole purpose was to ensure that the name Lana Turner produced a specific and commercially useful set of associations in the minds of the American public. What that version was built to obscure was a young woman named Julia Jean Turner, who had arrived in Hollywood as a teenager and been processed almost immediately into a product. MGM signed Turner when she was 16 years old. The studio that received her was not interested in the interior life of a teenage girl from Wallace, Idaho. It was interested in the commercial potential of a particular arrangement of physical attributes, and it proceeded to build around that arrangement, or an identity so complete and so thoroughly maintained that the person inside it had very little room to exist as a separate entity. Her appearance was manageable. Her relationships were managed. Her public statements were managed. The line between Lana Turner, the studio construction, and Julia Jean Turner, the human being, was drawn so early and enforced so consistently that the distinction became, for practical purposes, invisible, including, at times, to Turner herself. The documented accounts of her years at MGM describe a woman who was simultaneously one of the studio's most profitable assets and one of its least protected human beings. And the substances administered to keep her performing at the pace the studio required, corroborated in multiple biographical accounts and in Turner's own memoir, were provided not out of care for her welfare, but out of a calculation about production schedules. The relationships the studio encouraged and discouraged were evaluated not by their effect on her happiness, but by their effect on her marketability. The press that covered her with such apparent intimacy was operating under guidelines that ensured the coverage served MGM's interests before it served the truth. The suppression was not organized in a single meeting. It was the continuous, daily output of an institution that had decided, at its foundation, that Lana Turner the product was more valuable than Julia Jean Turner the person, and that any evidence of the latter that threatened the former was a problem to be managed rather than a truth to be honored. She survived MGM. She survived the marriages and the headlines and the night in 1958 when her daughter Cheryl stabbed her companion Johnny Stompanato in circumstances that exposed, in a single devastating public moment, everything the studio machinery had been built to conceal. The violence, the instability, the accumulated cost of 2 decades spent inside a construction not of her own making. The studio that had built her image spent the weeks that followed that night working to protect what remained of it. The woman at the center of the story was, once again, a secondary consideration. Lana Turner made films for another 2 decades after MGM. She was, in those later years, considerably more candid about the nature of what she had lived through than the studio system had ever encouraged her to be. She passed away in 1995. The product MGM built has outlasted everything. The person it was built around deserved better than to be its raw material, and that is the suppression that the glamour was always designed to prevent anyone from seeing clearly. The comeback designed to fail. Lana Turner's later years. By the early 1960s, Lana Turner was in her 40s, and every person of consequence in Hollywood understood that her relationship with the major studio system that had defined her career was functionally over. MGM, which had built her and profited from her across more than 2 decades, had released her. The infrastructure that had managed every dimension of her professional existence, the publicity apparatus, the contract protection, the institutional machinery that had simultaneously constrained and supported her, was gone. What remained was a woman of extraordinary screen presence and genuinely considerable talent, navigating an industry that had changed around her in ways that left the stars it had manufactured in the classical era with very little institutional support and very little honest acknowledgement of what their years of service had actually cost them. The productions Turner accepted in those years were presented, in each case, as opportunities for renewal. The press materials used the language of comeback, of return, of rediscovery. But what the productions themselves frequently offered was something considerably less generous. Projects under-resourced in ways that placed maximum pressure on the performer at the center of them, organized with a casualness about her welfare that contrasted sharply with the intensity of the studio's interest in her welfare during the years when her box office returns had made that interest commercially rational. Turner's own accounts of those years, given in interviews and in her memoir, Lana, the Lady, the Legend, the Truth, described the experience of navigating a professional landscape that had removed the structures she had always operated within and replaced them with nothing. Not freedom, not support, but simply absence. The studio system had been a cage. Its removal did not open a door so much as eliminate the walls entirely, leaving her in a space with no map and no institutional memory of what she had given to the industry that was now finished with her. She continued working. She took the roles that were offered. She brought to each of them the professionalism that 2 decades of MGM training had made so deeply habitual, it had become indistinguishable from instinct. The performances she gave in those later years contain, for anyone willing to look carefully, a particular quality that her earlier work, shaped and constrained by studio requirements, had rarely been permitted to show so openly. The full weight of everything she had carried, visible at last in a face the camera had been pointing at for 30 years, finally allowed it to mean something beyond what the publicity department required it to mean. None of that is either the saddest possible ending to a story like hers or the most honest one. Possibly, it was both. The woman who had made MGM hundreds of millions of dollars across 3 decades was, in her final professional chapter, working without a net, and she showed up anyway, every time, and gave whatever the work required. The institution that had built her was long gone. What it had built was still there, and what it had never allowed her to be, a full and complicated human being in full and complicated view, emerged anyway, in the end, because it had no other place left to go. The woman who was watched, Kim Novak and Harry Cohn. Harry Cohn ran Columbia Pictures as an expression of personal dominion so complete that the distinction between the studio and himself had ceased to have practical meaning. He was openly contemptuous of the concept that the people who worked for him were separate human beings with interior lives that did not belong to him. He was, by the documented testimony of nearly everyone who worked at Columbia during his tenure, one of the most formidable and most ruthless figures the industry ever produced. Kim Novak was one of Columbia's greatest stars. Vertigo, Picnic, Bell Book, and Candle, a body of work demonstrating a quality of melancholy intelligence that directors like Alfred Hitchcock understood immediately and used with precision. She was also, in Harry Cohn's framework, an asset, a property, something he had invested in and therefore owned, in whatever sense of ownership he found applicable. The surveillance Cohn maintained over Novak's private life is documented in multiple serious biographies, but most comprehensively in Bob Thomas's King Cohn. Her relationships were monitored. Her telephone calls were intercepted. Her social movements were tracked by individuals reporting directly to Cohn. This was not the general background surveillance the studio system applied loosely to all its contract players. It was specific, intensive, and personal. Harry Cohn tracked her every movement. He knew who she saw, where she went, and who she loved. And when he disapproved of what he found, he acted. When Novak began a relationship with Sammy Davis Jr., a relationship that both parties confirmed in documented interviews, and that was, by their own accounts, genuine, Cohn's response was direct. Intermediaries with connections to organized crime were employed to communicate to Davis that the relationship was to end. Davis spoke about this intervention in his autobiography, Yes, I Can, with a frankness that leaves the essential facts beyond reasonable dispute. Kim Novak has spoken in her later years about the psychological cost of those years with a precision and dignity that makes the listening difficult. She left Hollywood relatively early for a woman of her talent and her standing, a decision that, understanding the full picture of what her career had required her to endure, became not a mystery but the most logical choice available to her. The industry that knew everything about Harry Cohn's methods offered sympathy only once he was no longer present to make its silence commercially necessary. Every person who worked at Columbia during those years knew what Cohn was doing to the woman whose films were making them all wealthy. They said nothing while it was happening. They offered condolences afterward. That timing tells its own story, and it is not a flattering one. 27 treatments. Jean Tierney. In her autobiography, published in 1979, entitled Self-Portrait, Jean Tierney recorded the number with a plainness that made it more devastating than any dramatic framing could have achieved. 27 electroshock treatments. That is what the medical establishment of the 1950s determined her condition required. 27 separate procedures, each involving the passage of electrical current through her brain, administered across a period of hospitalization that removed her from the life she had known and the person she had been. Electroconvulsive therapy, as practiced in the 1950s, was substantially different from the more carefully calibrated procedures that modern medicine employs in limited circumstances. The treatments of Tierney's era were administered with a frequency and intensity that current medical literature documents as causing significant and lasting memory loss. Tierney herself recorded this consequence with the same plainness she brought to the number. The treatments had taken years of her memory, not the painful years she might have wished to forget, years indiscriminately, the happy ones, the ordinary ones, the irreplaceable ordinary ones. Jean Tierney's genuine suffering is not in question. The trauma that preceded her hospitalization, contracting a serious illness while expecting a child after a fan broke quarantine to meet her, on the subsequent arrival of her daughter Daria, with severe developmental disabilities requiring lifelong institutional care, the guilt that compounded itself for years without resolution was real and devastating. She needed and deserved genuine medical care. Tierney was a woman who had moved through the highest levels of Hollywood society. She had relationships, knowledge, and observations that a lucid and articulate Jean Tierney might have had occasion to discuss. A Tierney whose memory had been substantially diminished by treatment was a considerably less coherent witness to her own experience and to everything she had witnessed in the years before her hospitalization. The question may have a straightforwardly medical answer that the available record simply does not contain. But before we grant that possibility, consider what we do know. Who determined that 27 was the necessary number? What clinical standard produced that figure specifically? Who decided when it was sufficient and on what basis? She wrote the number down. She put it in her own book, in her own words, so that someone, eventually, might think to ask. 27. It sits there on the page, still unanswered. The asylum they built around her, Frances Farmer. Frances Farmer arrived in Hollywood in the mid-1930s, carrying everything the studio system claimed to want and everything it actually feared. She was extraordinarily talented, a Paramount contract player whose abilities drew comparisons to the finest stage actresses of her generation. She was also politically outspoken, intellectually formidable, and constitutionally unwilling to perform the grateful compliance the studio system had refined into an art form. The studio system had a word for women who behaved as Frances Farmer behaved. That word was difficult. It was applied early, applied consistently, and it shaped every institutional response to her deteriorating situation when that situation began in 1942, because I understand what that word actually meant in the context of the studio system of that era. It did not mean untalented. It did not mean unprofessional. It meant unwilling to be owned. The sequence of legal proceedings that resulted in Farmer's commitment to Western State Hospital in Washington involved a convergence of interests that biographer William Arnold documented in his extensively researched account, Shadowland. Her mother, Lillian, initiated commitment proceedings. The Los Angeles legal system processed them with a speed that observers of the period found notable. Paramount Pictures, which held her contract and which had obligations to her that her incapacitation would render moot, was in a position to intervene on her behalf at multiple documented junctures. At each of those junctures, Paramount looked away. Every single time the studio could have redirected what was happening toward medical help rather than institutionalization, it chose not to act. The woman they had employed and profited from was more manageable as a legal incompetent than as a contracted employee with rights and a voice. And the legal system they were dealing with was entirely willing to be helpful. And the treatments Farmer received at Western State Hospital included insulin shock therapy, administered with an aggressiveness that modern medicine regards with considerable concern. She remained institutionalized for years. The woman who emerged was, by multiple accounts of people who had known her before, diminished in ways that went beyond the ordinary passage of time. Her career did not recover. She passed away in 1970, her story known primarily to film historians and the colleagues who had watched what happened to her from a careful professional distance. The word they had used for her, difficult, had done its work. It had made her suffering feel like a consequence rather than an injustice, and had made the institutions that processed her seem like responses rather than causes. Frances Farmer was difficult. Difficult enough to be committed. Difficult enough to be treated. Difficult enough to disappear. That word, and everything it was used to justify, is suppression, and it is still running. We are past the halfway point of these 16 stories, and I genuinely want to know which of them has surprised you most. Please leave that in the comments, and tell us which corner of Hollywood's golden age you would like this channel to explore next. Your answers shape what we cover. The woman history loved away. Louise Tracy. Her name was Louise Tracy. You probably do not know it as well as you should. And the reason you do not is itself a story. One of the most quietly complete erasures in Hollywood history, accomplished not through malice or deliberate suppression, but through something more efficient than either. A romantic legend that had no commercial or emotional use for a complicated woman. The love story of Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn is one of Hollywood's most enduring romantic legends. 26 years, the Catholic guilt, the great love that could not officially name itself, the deathbed devotion. It is a beautiful story, and its beauty is not fabricated. What is fabricated, constructed through decades of selective telling, is the picture of that story as complete in itself, requiring no other significant figure to understand it. Louise Tracy married Spencer Tracy in 1923 and remained his wife until his passing in 1967, through everything those 44 years contained. She knew about Katharine Hepburn. She had known for most of it. She chose, with a clarity and a dignity that the romantic legend has consistently failed to honor, to remain. What Louise Tracy did with the pain of her situation is the story that has been suppressed most completely, not through any act of malice, but through the simpler mechanism of a narrative that found her inconvenient. In 1942, while her husband was struggling and his famous companion was waiting, Louise Tracy founded the John Tracy Clinic. She founded it because her son John had been born without hearing, and because the options available to families of children with hearing difficulties in that era were inadequate in ways she found unacceptable. The clinic she built became internationally recognized as a center of innovation, teaching children with hearing difficulties to speak and supporting the families who loved them. It is still operating. It has served tens of thousands of families across 8 decades. It was built by a woman who had every reason to be consumed by her private grief, and who chose instead to transform that grief into something that would outlast everyone connected to the love story that had produced it. Katharine Hepburn understood what Louise had given. On documented occasions, she donated anonymously to the clinic. The gesture is touching, and it is also, in its anonymity, a precise acknowledgement of the arrangement that had been made. Hepburn's name beside Louise's would have complicated the story too much. The donation traveled quietly, as Louise Tracy herself had been required to travel through her own life, present, consequential, and officially invisible. The woman who actually held everything together, who turned private heartache into international legacy, and who asked for nothing, was written out of the story not because she was unimportant, but because she was too important to fit inside it. Her clinic endures, her name does not. That is the suppression, elegant, bloodless, and complete. The exile that was an execution. Ingrid Bergman. In February of 1949, Colorado Senator Edwin C. Johnson stood on the floor of the United States Senate and delivered a speech describing Ingrid Bergman as, among other characterizations, a powerful influence for degradation. Bergman, who was at that moment in Italy and expecting a child with Roberto Rossellini while still technically married to her first husband, was denounced before the legislative body of the most powerful nation on earth. Churches called for boycotts of her films. Fond correspondence that had previously carried admiration arrived carrying contempt. Within weeks, she was effectively exiled from the American film industry for what would become 7 years. The affair was real. The expectant circumstances were real. Bergman had made choices that deviated from the image of virtuous wholesomeness her career had been built upon, and she had made them openly. These are facts. Here is another fact. Senator Edwin C. Johnson had been constructing a documented legislative campaign to bring the American film industry under federal regulatory control for several years before Ingrid Bergman gave him his example. He needed a figure whose fall from grace would be both maximally dramatic and maximally legible. Someone the audience had loved enough that the betrayals would feel personal. That Bergman's carefully cultivated image as a symbol of female virtue, so aggressively promoted precisely because it distinguished her from the typical Hollywood presentation, made her the ideal instrument for Johnson's purposes. He did not create the affair. He found it, and he used it with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Male stars engaging in conduct identical or worse during the same period faced no Senate speeches. The commercial beneficiaries of Bergman's 7-year absence, the roles that opened, the contracts that became available, the competitive landscape that rearranged itself in her absence, are identifiable. Nobody organized her punishment with a single coordinating hand. What happened was more efficient than conspiracy. Multiple interests found themselves simultaneously served by the same outcome, and they pursued it through the mechanisms available to them. When Bergman returned with Anastasia in 1956, she received an Academy Award and a standing ovation. The same industry that had exiled her rehabilitated her with equal efficiency and equal insincerity. Nobody acknowledged the engineered nature of either movement. The affair was always going to be the official story. It was a better story than the truth, which was that a woman had been selected, targeted, and processed through a punishment architecture built for exactly this purpose, while the men who built that architecture returned to their offices and their contracts and their uninterrupted careers. And the suppressed truth was never the affair. It was the deliberate political architecture of the punishment, constructed in full public view and never once, in 75 years, named for what it was. The agreement nobody examined, the Rat Pack and Las Vegas picture. A particular evening in 1958, a journalist sits ringside at the Sands Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas and watches Frank Sinatra perform to a full house. In the journalist's possession that evening is a document he has received from a source he trusts. The document describes, in the dry language of federal surveillance, exactly who owns the room he is sitting in and exactly how they came to own it. He watches the performance. He goes home. He files a story about the show. The document stays where it is. No one asked him to do this. No one threatened him, and no one needed to. He had simply made the calculation, the same calculation that every journalist covering Las Vegas in those years made by the later testimony of several who were present, that the glamour was worth more than the question. And he was not wrong about the glamour. In the late 1950s, the Sands Hotel was the most glamorous room in America. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop performed there in combinations that created something the entertainment industry had not previously produced, a spectacle so charged with genuine camaraderie, genuine talent, and genuine electricity that audiences felt, sitting in that room, that they were present at the center of the world. They were not wrong about the electricity. The talent was real. The friendship was real. The performances those men gave in that room were among the finest of their careers. What the audiences in those seats were not examining, and what the press corps was collectively declining to examine, was the question of who owned the room they were all sitting in. The Sands Hotel was substantially financed by individuals whose connections to organized crime are documented in Federal Bureau of Investigation surveillance files from the period. Those files are not classified. They have been publicly available for decades and examined by journalists and biographers whose findings are a matter of record. Frank Sinatra's specific relationships with figures identified in those files were the subject of active Bureau investigation across multiple years, documented in released Bureau records that Sean Levy drew upon in his thoroughly researched account Rat Pack Confidential. The performances were so magnificent, the personalities so compelling, the whole spectacle so irresistible, that the press and public collectively chose not to look at the foundation. The men on that stage were genuinely magnificent. They were also performing in a room built by people who would have threatened them as easily as they employed them. Frank Sinatra knew the room he was standing in. He performed anyway. The glamour was its own enforcement mechanism, the most elegant suppression in this collection, while requiring no coercion because the dream was simply too beautiful for anyone present to want to examine what was holding it up. The witnesses who never fully agreed. Natalie Wood. Natalie Wood appeared on screen for the first time at the age of 4. By the time she was 8, she had made Miracle on 34th Street, and the particular quality she possessed, a naturalness so complete it barely registered as performance, was visible to anyone watching. By 15, she had made Rebel Without a Cause. By 23, she had made West Side Story. The arc of her career was not merely successful. It was one of the most sustained demonstrations of developing artistic intelligence that Hollywood's golden years produced. She passed away on November 28, 1981, in the water near Catalina Island, at the age of 43, where the official finding was accidental drowning. The case was closed. In 2011, 30 years after her passing, the Los Angeles County authorities formally reopened the investigation. The reopening was based on new information provided by Dennis Davern, the captain of the yacht Splendor, on which Wood had been spending the weekend with her husband Robert Wagner and actor Christopher Walken. Davern stated in documented interviews, given with the specificity of a man who had been carrying his account for 3 decades, that his original statement to investigators had been incomplete, and that he had been discouraged from speaking fully in the immediate aftermath of her passing. The bruising documented on Wood's body was assessed differently by the reviewing examiner in 2011 than it had been by the original. The accounts given by those present on the boat across 40 years of interviews and legal proceedings have not fully aligned with each other or with the physical evidence as reassessed. What can be stated honestly is this: there is a documented gap between what was witnessed on that boat and what was officially recorded in 1981. The formal reopening of the investigation confirmed that gap was real enough to warrant official re-examination. Whether that gap represents deliberate suppression, self-protective incompleteness, the natural inconsistency of traumatic recollection, or some combination of all three, the investigation has not been established. Yet what it has established is that the full account of that night has never been given, and that the people with the most direct knowledge of what happened have consistently had the most direct reasons to be incomplete. That is where the record stands. The case remains open, and the fact that it stands there, unresolved, contested, officially acknowledged as incomplete after 40 years and the involvement of a formal reinvestigation, is itself an answer of a kind. Not the answer, but an answer. The voice that was never heard. Marilyn Monroe's recorded interviews. We have now reached the final story in these 16 chapters, and if you have been listening carefully, you may have noticed something building across everything we have covered. The suppressions have grown more complete as we have gone. The earliest ones required a studio head's decision and 4 people's cooperation. The later ones required a government program, a network of journalists, and an entire industry's silence. This final story involves a suppression so architecturally complete that it has outlasted everyone who may have constructed it. It is still running. The evidence of it is still missing. And the woman at the center of it was, at the moment it began, simply trying to tell her own story in her own words. In the months before her passing in August of 1962, Marilyn Monroe was engaged in a project that the official mythology surrounding her has largely failed to accommodate. She was speaking, deliberately, at length, on the record, with the specific intention of constructing her own narrative of her own life in her own voice. She was conducting recorded interviews with journalist Georges Belmont and had been in conversation with others about a formal autobiography. Multiple individuals documented the existence of these recordings. They are referenced in correspondence, in appointment books, in the accounts of people who were present when they were made. Those recordings have never been found. Anthony Summers, whose biography Goddess remains one of the most extensively sourced accounts of Monroe's life, documented in specific detail the circumstances of the immediate aftermath of her passing. Individuals gained access to her home in the hours following the discovery of her body. The authorization of some of those individuals to remove materials from the property has never been clearly established. Correspondence, appointment books, and recordings that were documented as present in the immediate aftermath subsequently became inaccessible. Summers named sources, cited specific accounts, and drew conclusions the available evidence supported, while being precise about the distinction between what was documented and what was inferred. The commercial architecture surrounding Monroe's image is relevant here in a way it is not for most historical suppressions. Her likeness rights generate tens of millions of dollars annually. The canonical Monroe, wordless, iconic, eternal, the image on the poster is worth an enormous and quantifiable sum. Monroe, who had been speaking on the record about her own life, her own relationships, her own understanding of what had been done to her and what she had done, is a different proposition entirely. She is a specific woman with a specific perspective, and specific women with specific perspectives are considerably more complicated to manage than icons. Whether the recordings were deliberately suppressed, accidentally lost in the chaos of an investigation that had its own considerable complications, or removed by individuals acting in their own interests without coordination, has not been established. What has been established is that a woman was speaking, that she was recording what she said, that multiple witnesses documented those recordings, and that none of what she said has ever been heard. 60 years later, Hollywood's most famous voice remains, in the end, a silence. She was forming her own story. She did not survive to complete it, and the silence that replaced it, whatever produced it, whoever allowed it, however it was maintained across 6 decades, is the most complete erasure in all of these 16 stories. Not because of what was hidden, but because of what was spoken before it was hidden. A woman's voice, her own words, gone. If what you have heard in these 16 chapters has moved you, if you believe these women and these men deserve to be remembered in their full complicated truth, rather than in the simplified versions that served other people's purposes, please like this video and share it with someone who loves classic Hollywood. It is genuinely the only way these stories keep traveling. What strikes you, sitting with all of these together, is not the villainy, though there is villainy here. It is the system, the way none of this required a single coordinating hand. It operated through institutional interest, the commercial calculation, and the simple human preference for a beautiful story over a complicated one. These suppressions were not accidents, and they were not coincidences. They were the predictable output of a machine that had decided, at its foundation, that the truth about certain people was a problem to be managed. These are not stories about celebrities. They are stories about human beings who found ways, imperfect, costly, sometimes at tremendous personal expense, to remain human beings inside the most sophisticated image management machinery the world had ever produced. The grief went somewhere. The constraint went somewhere. The daily performance of an identity not their own went somewhere. It went into the work. And the work is still here. That is what these stories are owed, to be told fully and to be heard the same way. Thank you for spending this time with these stories. If this video gave you something, please like it and share it with someone who loves classic Hollywood. Subscribe if you want more. There are many more corners of this era that deserve this kind of honest attention, and we intend to give every one of them exactly that. Leave a comment telling us which story stayed with you the longest. Until next time, this is Golden Age Files, honoring the full and complicated humanity of the stars who built Hollywood's golden dream.